with the internet, we're aware potentially of everything going on everywhere at all moments. People can't make sense of all this change, and so they shut down.
Hey, Mark, thanks for coming on the pod.
Glad to be here.
For folks who aren't as familiar with your work, I thought maybe it'd be a good place to start just by giving us a little kind of penny tour through your backstory and your political journey.
Well, I guess relevant to this podcast, I got involved in intellectual politics when I became an editor of The Public Interest back in 1980 and worked for Irving Kristol and ended up going back to Harvard to get my PhD and worked very closely with Daniel Bell and Mac Laser and knew Pat Moynihan. And so I was part of that whole world and then found myself drifting away from it in the 1990s as the neocon world changed, became more populist. And since then, I've been I feel like I'm the last Mohican of the Moynihan tradition among my peers. I guess me and Leon Wiesel's here.
Well, maybe Bill's kind of returned back to you.
Well, he has.
He's maybe a lost sheep in the and
prodigal son. Prodigal son is back, right? With a big car and tail fins. Yeah. I got my PhD. I'm now a professor at Columbia. I've been at Chicago, been at NYU. My main place to write has been the New York Review of Books, though now I'm also writing regularly for Liberties, quite happily. If your listeners don't know what Liberties is, it's an extraordinary quarterly edited by Leon Wieseltier that is as close to you can come to the partisan review for our time. And so I find myself in this position of being the kind of centrist realist who annoys progressives. And I still have relations with people on the conservative side, and I write about what's going on in the right, mainly with a broken heart. My books, I've mainly been, I guess you might say, studying the dark side of the street. My interests have been in the counter-enlightenment, in the radical right, and have a couple of collections with the New York Review called Shipwreck Mind, Reckless Mind. A few years ago, I blew up the internet with an article in the New York Times called The End of Identity Liberalism, which turned into a book that did not blow up my bank account, but still, it's out there.
So this is where I first came to be aware of you. Was I think, unfortunately, I wish I could say it was by reading Liberties Quarterly, but it was from the Sam Harris podcast when you were speaking about this a while back. And so I want to get into your new book and your coverage of the reactionary politics. But if we could just spend a moment on the kind of Democratic side of the aisle. You wrote then in that Once and Future Liberal, like you write as a frustrated American liberal. You had written that liberals bring many things to electoral contests, values, commitment, policy proposals, but they have not brought an image of what our shared way of life might be. Then you wrote into kind of identity politics and how that fragments. I just would wonder if you'd spend a moment kind of trying to encapsulate your arguments there, because they're very relevant right now, as those are the types of things a lot of Democrats are reflecting on today.
Yeah, it's sort of become common wisdom now. It was not when, I first wrote in 2016. But my argument is not so much that the Democratic Party is not middle of the road. It's rather that ever since 1972 or so, the Democratic, those on the liberal left have thought of themselves as belonging to a number of different movements connected to various causes. At first, it was particular causes like Vietnam, the environment, feminism, and so on. And progressively it became divided up by identity groups. But what Democrats lack that Republicans have is an idea that while there are causes, there's also the cause. And that without securing electoral power, we can't do anything about the other little causes that we're interested in. But we're not adapted to talking to each other even about what our larger purposes are, what kind of society we see, what kind of vision of America inspires us that in fact is inclusive in the best sense. So I talk about the potential glue being a heightened sense of citizenship, and giving that a kind of content, a kind of social citizenship as well, for understanding our commitments with the welfare state.
That's not too dislined from kind of something that Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, was talking about when I interviewed him a while back, and trying to kind of encapsulate how, I think he called it like a liberal patriotism,
Yeah.
which is in some ways has a relationship with citizenship. I'm just wondering, is there anything out there that you've seen that has encouraged you, or that has animated you, coming from folks on the left who are trying to work through all this in the fallout of the election?
Well, not yet. What I didn't say about the book is that I especially focused on the atomizing effect of identity politics on the liberal left side. And so in terms of developing a comprehensive view that people of every class could relate to of what a good America would look like, we're still stuck being hated, in 9/10 of the country.
Yeah.
I've not seen anything. Somewhere I wrote that after I wrote my New York Times article, I met with some people about setting up summer schools that would be like the ones that exist on the right. So Hertog and AEI and all those things that create a whole cadre of people who are trained to think about the cause in terms of both serious books, but also in terms of policy and meeting political actors. We've never had anything like that on our side. And so I circulated a kind of mission plan to various people, talked to Senator Bennett and so on, and various foundations, and no one really nibbled. And finally, one of the funders took me out for a drink. He said, look, I love this thing. If I had the money, I'd do it myself. Let me tell you why it's not going to happen. He said, people in my class, the donor class, don't understand what you're saying. Why? Because they think their idea of engaging in politics is to do three things in this order: to focus on an issue, to focus on a candidate, and to focus on the next election.
Yeah.
Whereas when I was at the Public Interest in the 1980s and these summer schools were starting, and I'm working for Irving Kristol and these student newspapers were starting, there was this sense that you had to grab a whole generation and educate them and get them to know each other. And now, of course, as you know better than I do, people in these quite large circles now, they date each other, they marry each other, they divorce each other. Their kids are now becoming journalists and working in government. It's a whole subworld. But we on the Democratic side are just all divided by our little issues. So I'm hoping this summer to devote some time to doing something either in Harper's or the Atlantic, laying forward this idea and seeing if anyone who has money in institutions is interested in pursuing it.
Yeah. And the Turning Point USA side of this, I went to, I go to their year-end thing every year just to kind of stay in touch with what's happening on the MAGA youth. And I usually write kind of a funny article making fun of them at the end of the thing. But this year, at the beginning of it, I was like, I had to include kind of a preamble, which is, yes, there's some ridiculousness and some things that are noxious and taste, and horrific about it, really. But it's like hard to imagine a Democratic version of it, and like that's a problem, right? Okay, one last thing on the Democratic side: is there any do you feel like, do you sense in the people that you're talking to, obviously since you're kind of a point person on a critique of identity politics, I'm sure you hear from people, like, do you sense that things are really changing, or that there's kind of a papering over? Like, do you think that it's sunk in, the pernicious elements of it? Obviously there were some good parts too, but that and people are trying to pivot back, or do you think that that's more lip service at this point?
Well, my answer before January would have been that on the one hand, it's being institutionalized, and in a way that it becomes anodyne, despite the huge bureaucracies. But bureaucracies have trouble persecuting people. When you have a small office, you can do it, but not when you have a whole bureaucracy. But then Trump comes along with his anti-DEI campaign, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, striking the fear of God in everyone. And, I'm in one of those positions that people who follow politics are often in, where we don't like the way something is done, but are glad that something pernicious is gone or is leaving. I think it's an opportunity for our side, actually, to rethink affirmative action, because I'm so for affirmative action. The problem is that it got generalized so that it applied to all these different groups, where essentially the original concern was and still ought to be Black America. But it's hard legally to do that, to focus, right? So I'm hoping a reset will allow universities and businesses to do this in a more informal way, since obviously people in these institutions are committed to it, without the mandates coming from above and without the bureaucracies in our institutions.
Yeah. Before we get to the book, one other of your kind of past focuses I just wanted to talk about a little bit was reactionary politics. I was watching an interview you did with Andrew Sullivan, where he asked you to explain the difference between kind of conservative impulse and the reactionary one. And but boy, I think the interview was like 8 years ago, but it feels extremely timely of a question now. So I wanted to re-up it with you.
Yeah, it is, I think. Well, in my view, we have two ideological pairs of adversaries in our political thinking and also in our political engagements. The older one, well, it's older in the sense, in the American sense, but the older one is the tension between liberals and conservatives. And that difference, to my view, is rests on serious difference in the understanding of human nature and of the nature of society. That is, how human beings interact, and therefore how institutions should be shaped. And conservatives have a more organic view of society, of individuals' relation to society, contrary to the advertising. In fact, genuine conservatives ought to be in favor of constant change, because you're changing according to new conditions, but it's done slowly and organically. Liberals, on the other hand, stress, so that's Oakeshott, right? Liberals, on the other hand, stress individual initiative, our freedom from organic society, even while being part of it, and feeling that the conservatives underestimate individuals and underestimate what we can do collectively. Okay, that's one pair. Yeah. Then the other pair, which grows out of the French Revolution, are two ideologies that are not about human nature, but about history, about the nature of history. And both of them share a kind of apocalyptic, messianic view of history. So one is the left revolutionary tradition from the French Revolution through the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution. And that's the idea that the fundamental struggle is over the course of history. Who's going to control the future. And the understanding that something is built up in history that then has to be grasped and then pushed in a certain direction. And so on the left side, the idea was that you would bring to a boiling point the contradictions of capitalism, and out of that, you would get a new society. Reactionaries, on the other hand, had this mindset that there's been a rip in history, that there was a time in which we lived pretty well, organic society, communities, and all the rest. And then one day there was a kind of nakba, and something changed in the West or in the United States, where after which everything that was valuable organically in our society came under attack. Individuals became less virtuous, less happy. We became a country of radical individualists, whether it comes to our social behavior or it comes to our economic activity. We end up with an atomized society, and we end up just being soulless cogs in a big machine. And so the reactionary, though, has two impulses. Possible impulses. One is to let's go back to the past. And certainly one sees that on the right today. And it's been there for a while. The other one, and this is closer to Trumpianism, the other reactionary view is that what we want to do is move into the future, but inspired by the past, so that we get a new muscular future that's inspired by the way America used to be. But it's going to be not bucolic, but rather it's going to be muscular and strong and authoritative and all the rest. In both of those positions, the nostalgia for the past and the idea of leaping to the future are deeply anti-liberal and deeply anti-conservative.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it was funny listening to you talk about this with Andrew. Like that conservative impulse as you describe it, right? The communitarian, the society matters, community matters. It should, make change slowly, be skeptical of change. And that impulse is just like completely non-existent. Like just listening to you describe it was very clarifying in that, we are very much in a reactionary moment, and there are different strains of it, right? I mean, you've written about kind of the far radical, Christian nationalist side of the reactionary movement that we're seeing on the right, and then there's more of the tech version of that, but like, do you think that is right, and like that kind of reordering feels like nothing's permanent, right? But like that reordering feels like it's here to stay for a little while to me.
Yeah, somehow an aquarium has been turned into fish soup, and we have to figure out how to turn it back into an aquarium, right? Yeah. Well, it's been interesting. I mean, if we talk about personalities, what happened to Rod Dreher or what happened to Patrick Deneen, they began speaking like the genuine conservatives. Rod more in a kind of Blakean romantic view of the past, where with Patrick it was more old small town America. It was very attractive. His first book was really good. I mean, his first political book. And then something happens, and Trump coming on the scene and Orban coming on the scene somehow flipped a switch in the minds of certain people. Now, there's still some people on the right of the old style. I think of Yuval Levin, and I'm sure there are other people that at AEI that you can come up with. But this toxin has entered the bloodstream.
Yeah. I mean, anybody that you name, and with love to Yuval, like, is not really meaningfully part of the party right now.
Well, certainly when it comes
as far as power is concerned,
as far as comes to power, that's right. That voice just gets killed, and so I spent a week. I was invited to teach in the summer school at the University of Austin at Texas, 2 summers ago. And it was weirdly schizophrenic. So they have these courses that are called like forbidden courses.
Just for people who don't know, the University of Austin is kind of the Barry Weiss and some other folks did kind of a spin-off quasi-university. It's not, I don't think it's an accredited university at this point.
It is, I think it is.
That's more for like challenging, the status quo, challenging the way that universities are teaching our kids. So anyway, just to give people that, mostly from the right perspective.
Yeah.
Give people that backstory.
However, the president of it, Pano, I forget his last name, a Greek name, he was the former president of St. John's. And so when he came on, the vibe that was given off is that actually we're going to be kind of St. John's University with students who may have these right-wing politics, but they'd simply want to get away from a liberal environment, but we'll do what St. John's did. And so I gave a course precisely on this subject, the difference between conservatives and reactionaries. Great kids from 9 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. And then there was an afternoon program where it was, it was just flag waving, own the libs, all these odd tech types who came in from Silicon Valley, futurist types, some of them talking about René Girard and all the rest. And it was just, and the kids themselves noticed it. They said, we're getting whiplash here, going from reading Roger Scruton and Michael Oakeshott in the morning and talking about DEI in the afternoon as if they're connected. It's one thing if, you have, you go to your study and study the great books and then you go out for the fight. But there's this impression that these things have to connect. And it was a big disappointment. I had some hope that maybe it would work out, but it's not.
Okay, let's get to your book, Ignorance and Bliss, because there is, I think, a through line here and a connection there, which is one of the lines you have is that reactionary politics are flourishing in our liquid world, should surprise no one. So make this connection for us to the book and to like why you think this might be happening now on a deeper kind of level.
Yeah. Well, just to give a super quick précis of the book.
Please.
It's something I began working on 25 years ago when I gave a lecture at Chicago on this theme and was picking at over the years. And the book is really about the human desire not to know and what the psychology of that is and what the implications are for our beliefs about the soul and God and spirit, how we think about children and innocence, how we think about coping with the present and imagining a more perfect past. But the core of the book, the beginning of it, is kind of not so much an argument as an unveiling of the complicated psychology or the psychological forces that we're beset by to know and not to know. And so Aristotle says everyone wants to know, which is true. But the will not to know is really not explored much in the philosophical tradition. But it shows up in literature, shows up in myth. So I begin with the myth of Oedipus, who wants to know and doesn't want to know what his relation is with his mother wife.
Yeah.
And then St. Augustine, we move to the present. So it's a kind of, I call it a ramble through some of these issues that on a theme that no one seems to pay attention to. It was not intended to come out.
Yeah. The theme being kind of like
during the
why do we want to block out the unpleasant information, like information essentially, like why is there this desire for ignorance?
Yeah, well, part of it is we couldn't get through the day if we didn't. An example I use in the book is imagine if everyone had an LED screen across the forehead where you just had a tape of what they were thinking at every moment. And if you engage with them, they're thinking about you, and you're reading about yourself, and they're reading about your reaction to them.
Works out on this podcast. Everybody's just hearing what I'm thinking at every moment, but maybe at society level, that might not.
Yeah, right. But you couldn't even develop as a self that you could know if yourself is nothing but the result of all this information coming in. So there are all sorts of things we block. We don't want our movies to be spoiled. We wrap presents before we.
Don't want to go to the doctor if you feel like you have a.
That's
for
some people. Do you want to know the sex of your kid? So there are all sorts of ways in which we. Certainly at my age, walking past a shop window is a very charged thing. I've got to suck my stomach in and hold my head in a certain way that it looks like I have more hair than I do. So we do it in life. But what happens is that at the much deeper level, we find it hard to cope with just the human condition. And we find it hard to cope with death. We find it hard to cope with uncertainty in particular. And so we don't quite know how to regulate our own curiosity or make sense of this desire. Some people are just naturally curious. We all know them, right? They're always looking stuff up online and looking at documentaries. And then there are people who generally think they don't need to know more than they do. And then there are people, and they're the interesting ones, who are really resistant to new information, right? They have, their views about things. This is my view about vaccines, and it's not going to change. And so I think about how people get into that sort of position. When it comes to politics, you can see how this would work itself out ideologically. But I also think we live in a special period, and that's what you mentioned. I've learned a lot from the books of a Polish sociologist now dead named Zygmunt Bauman, Baumann, that your listeners may or may not know. And he wrote a number of books with the word liquid in the title. The first one, The Liquid Society. And he was former Marxist, and he had this deep idea, which is that Marx's and Engels' idea of everything solid melting into air was for them a tragedy. They believed in solidity. And what they thought was that the sort of atomization of life under capitalism was unhealthy, and we needed to move to a more stable, just society, which would be after the revolution. But we find ourselves living in societies not where, as in archaic societies, that the institutions were born into exist when we die, or in a situation with maybe one or two things change. But we've created a world for ourselves where everything is changing all the time. And with the internet, we're aware potentially of everything going on everywhere at all moments.
Yeah.
And we're not built to cope with this. We're not built to live this way. We're sort of built to live on land, and instead we're all suddenly on surfboards, and the waves keep coming, and we're just trying to stay afloat. And in that sort of situation, this will to ignorance comes out as a kind of healthy one too, that people can't make sense of all this change, and so they shut down. They have certain views about sex and gender, case closed. They have certain views about old America, case closed. Certain views about tariffs, forget the evidence, right? That's the situation we're in now.
Yeah, and in that sense, it kind of ties to this, like, why, because you could imagine going the other way. I mean, like the tech utopians, like, made the opposite argument, right? Like, was that we were going to come to this moment where we had all this information at our fingertips. People are going to know more than ever. Like, it's not crazy to have thought that at this moment we would have reached a time of, peak curiosity, an interest in what was happening. And it feels like it's had the opposite result, right? There's been this retrenchment. And so to me, and kind of to reading the book, and a lot of it goes way, you're back at Aristotle and Oedipus for a lot of the book, but it's like, to me, a lot of this like most recent, developments is really phone related, like that it's like that some level, this like internal desire that we have to not want to know things that are unpleasant has been hypercharged by the fact that there's like so much unpleasant stuff being delivered to us at once.
Yeah, and the more, information we get, the more we feel we don't control our environment. And that's frightening. And, the tech futurists, they have this idea that, well, we're going to know so much. But a lot of what we have to know is what other people are like. But other people are changing all the time. And they're changing because things out in material life are changing. And so it's not that we have this information that comes out from a stable world and then we navigate it. It's not that. It's that we're surfing and causing the waves at the same time. And so our ability to master anything or when things go wrong, we don't have. Someone once pointed out to me that if you look at all the history of utopian schemes, none of them have prisons. They're ideal cities. There's no sense that anything could go wrong, right?
Yeah.
And the tech futurists are like that. They don't seem to want to recognize the limits of what we can take in and our need. We can't wake up every morning asking ourselves whether today is going to be a day when our parents love us, or it's one of those days when they're not. We need to have a kind of continuity in our beliefs just to get through the day. If we changed our beliefs every second that we got new information, we'd be frozen in time. So we need to kind of commit to an opinion for a while.
Yeah. I want to close. I'm just wondering if you have any like practical thoughts for the types of folks that are probably listening to this. And we have, small L liberal listeners mostly for the most part, and people that are more curious on that scale that you kind of laid out. But even with our listeners, look, I can just see it because we now know all the numbers, right? Like if I put up something that's like, this is going to be very bad news for Donald Trump, more people are likely to look at that than less, right? When I put up something that, that folks that listen to this are going to find unpleasant, either about what's happening in the news or what I think that the Democrats are doing or whatever, like fewer people are, or some people are going to be like, no, screw you. Why are you telling me this? Right. Like that's not everybody, but there's that strain is in all of us. Right. I don't listen to my favorite sports teams recap podcast after they lose. Like I only listen after they win. Right. And like there are little examples of this. So what, like, do you have any practical, kind of thought, having thought deeply about this, any practical ways for individually for people to kind of navigate the ignorance and bliss?
Well, with regard to politics, I guess the first thing is to notice what is happening. I mean, to notice this will to ignorance and how it pops up. And it can pop up on every side. I mean, if you just look at the reaction of the White House under Biden and the press in his last years, the strong refusal to believe their lying eyes was extraordinary, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing in the moment is that, as you said, conservatism is dead. These people are not conservatives. Yeah. And that you're up against reactionary forces that are all about will and not about understanding. And they have to be met by other sorts of means. But we can't keep up. We can't give up, our own quest for understanding precisely these things. So checking your priors and also just trying to get used to uncertainty when things change so much all the time. It's very hard to just sail forward And at least to be aware of that and what you're doing with regard to that just means more self-awareness.
Mark Lilla, really appreciate you. The book is Ignorance and Bliss. Thank you for coming on to the Bulwark podcast. And we'll be looking out for your writings in the future. Stay in touch.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
All right. Everybody else, we'll see you back here tomorrow for another edition of the Bulwark podcast. Peace.